The morning of October 30th, 1961. A frozen airfield on the Kola Peninsula in the far north of the Soviet Union. Major Andrei Durnovtsev walked toward his aircraft in the grey Arctic half-light. He was a career bomber pilot, calm and unremarkable, the kind of officer who followed orders and flew his routes and went home. But nothing about this morning was routine. Bolted into the belly of his plane was a weapon so large that the aircraft had been rebuilt to carry it. And before the day was over, that weapon would create the single most powerful explosion ever made by human hands. His plane was a Tu-95. The West called it the Bear. It was a giant, 4 engines, swept wings, designed to fly nuclear bombs across the world. But this particular Bear had been changed. Engineers had stripped out the bomb bay doors. They had pulled the fuel tanks from the body of the plane. They had painted the entire aircraft a brilliant, mirror-bright white. Not for beauty. The white paint was meant to bounce away heat. The heat of a blast that the crew were not entirely sure they would survive. What none of them fully understood as they climbed aboard that morning was that they were about to test the limits of the planet itself. The thing in the bomb bay had a quiet name. The scientists who built it simply called it Ivan. The Americans, watching from afar, would label the test Joe 111. History would remember it by a grander title, born of fear and a strange national pride. The Tsar Bomba, the king of bombs. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. It weighed 27 tons. That is roughly the weight of a fully loaded city bus. It was 8 meters long, about the length of a small bus laid on its side, and more than 2 meters across. It was so heavy that it weighed nearly as much as everything the Tu-95 was ever designed to carry. To even hold it, the engineers had to build special locks and a custom cradle. The bomb hung partly outside the body of the plane, too big to be tucked fully inside. And here is the part that is hard to take in. This was the smaller version. The original design called for a yield of 100 megatons, 100 million tons of explosive force. The men who built it had calculated that it could be pushed that high. But 100 megatons would have flooded half the northern world with radioactive fallout. It would have poisoned land far beyond any target. So the designers made a choice. They replaced part of the bomb's uranium shell with lead. The lead soaked up energy instead of feeding the reaction. That single change cut the power in half. Half. To around 50 megatons. To understand that number, set it against the bombs that ended the Second World War. The weapon dropped on Hiroshima was about 15 kilotons. The Tsar Bomba was more than 3,000 times stronger than that. Stack up both atomic bombs that struck Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki together, and the Tsar Bomba was still around 1,500 times more powerful than the pair of them combined. In one flash, it would release more energy than every bomb and shell fired by every army in all of the Second World War, several times over. This was not really a weapon. No general could ever use it. No plane could carry it far without being a slow, easy target. It could not fit on a missile. It served only one purpose. It was a message. And the man sending that message was the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. The Cold War was at its coldest. The two great powers had paused their nuclear tests for 3 years. Talks were underway to ban testing for good. But trust between the two sides had collapsed. Khrushchev wanted the world to see Soviet strength in a way that could not be argued with. A year earlier at the United Nations, he had used an old Russian saying. He promised to show the West Kuzka's mother. Roughly, it means, we'll teach you a lesson you won't forget. The Tsar Bomba was that lesson, written in fire. The men who designed it worked under almost impossible pressure. They were ordered to build the largest bomb in history, and they were given only about 16 weeks to do it. The work was led by a brilliant young physicist named Andrei Sakharov, working at the secret research city known only as Arzamas-16. Around him stood some of the finest scientific minds in the Soviet Union. They knew exactly what they were creating. They built it anyway, racing the clock, checking and rechecking numbers that had never been tested at this scale. Sakharov would later carry the weight of that work for the rest of his life. But that part of the story comes later. For now, on this freezing morning, the bomb was loaded. The crew was aboard, and the most dangerous part of the whole plan was about to begin. Because the great problem with the Tsar Bomba was not making it explode. The great problem was getting the people who dropped it far enough away to live. At around 9:30 in the morning, Dunovtsev's white Tu-95 rolled down the runway and lifted into the Arctic sky. There were 9 men aboard. Beside Dunovtsev sat his crew, his navigator, his gunners, his engineers, all of them trusted with the most secret flight in the country. They were not told they would certainly come home. They were told their chances were about even, 50-50, a coin toss with their own lives. They did not turn back. A second plane flew with them. A Tu-95 was joined by a smaller Tu-16 bomber, fitted out as a flying laboratory. Its job was to film the blast and take readings. Its commander was Colonel Vladimir Martinenko. Both crews flew north together, toward a place at the very edge of the inhabited world. Their target was Novaya Zemlya, a long, empty island chain in the Arctic Sea, far above the Arctic Circle. It was a place of ice and bare rock, chosen because almost no one lived there to be harmed. The flight took about 2 hours. 2 hours for 9 men to sit with their thoughts, knowing what hung beneath them. The plan to keep them alive rested on one clever piece of engineering. A parachute, not a small one. The bomb was fitted with an enormous parachute weighing about 800 kilograms, nearly the weight of a small car, all by itself. When the bomb fell, the parachute would open and slow it down. That delay was everything. It gave the 2 planes precious extra minutes to race away before the weapon reached the height where it was set to explode. The math was brutal and exact. Drop the bomb from too low and the planes could not escape the blast. Drop it and let it fall too fast, and the same. Every second of slowed descent was another stretch of distance between the crews and the fireball. As the Tu-95 reached the test zone, Dunovtsev brought the plane up to about 10,500 meters. That is around 34,000 feet, nearly 7 miles above the ground. Below stretched the white emptiness of Novaya Zemlya. The cameras on the second plane were rolling. The order came. The bomb was released. 27 tons fell away and the great parachute bloomed open behind it. Instantly, the aircraft was lighter by the weight of a loaded bus. Dunovtsev pushed the throttles forward and turned hard, climbing and running, putting every mile he could between his crew and the spot below. The bomb drifted down under its canopy. The clock ran. 3 minutes and 8 seconds. For the men in the cockpit, those must have been the longest minutes of their lives. They flew flat out across the Arctic, the white island falling away behind them, knowing the sky itself was about to catch fire. At about 11:30 in the morning, Moscow time, the Tsar Bomba reached 4,000 meters above the surface, around 13,000 feet. Its sensors triggered, and then a new sun was born over the Arctic. The fireball swelled in an instant to roughly 5 miles across. It was so enormous that it nearly reached back up to the height where the bomb had been dropped, climbing toward the very altitude the plane had just left. The ground below would normally have been touched by such a fireball, but the bomb's own shockwave bounced up off the earth and held the fire from spreading down. The flash was beyond anything in human experience. It was seen from about 1,000 kilometers away, more than 600 miles. People that far off saw a brilliant light burn the horizon, even though they were nowhere near. Heat poured outward in a wave. At 100 kilometers from the blast, it was enough to give a person severe burns. Every building at the small abandoned test settlement, well over 30 miles from the center, was flattened completely. Wooden houses, stone houses, all of it gone, swept away as if it had never been there. If you're an enthusiast of military technology and World War II, please consider subscribing to us. It would greatly help our channel. Thank you. But the crews in the two planes were not watching the light. They were running from it. 45 seconds after the explosion, the cloud was already rising past 30 kilometers into the sky. It kept climbing. The mushroom cloud finally towered to a height of around 64 kilometers, with some accounts putting it near 67. That is roughly 40 miles tall, 7 times the height of Mount Everest. The top of it pushed clear out of the part of the atmosphere where weather happens into the stratosphere and beyond. The clouds spread out into a cap nearly 60 miles wide. Anyone within hundreds of miles who looked north saw it standing over the curve of the earth, a thing that did not seem to belong to this world. Then the shockwave caught the planes. Dunovtsev's Tu-95 was about 39 kilometers from the blast point at the moment of detonation. By the time the pressure wave roared up behind him, he had pushed out to more than 100 kilometers. It did not matter. The wall of compressed air slammed into the aircraft like a giant hand. The bomber dropped. Witnesses and records describe the plane plunging roughly a kilometer, falling like a stone as the shockwave shoved it down through the sky. For a long, terrible moment, the most powerful bomber the Soviet Union could build was simply falling, its engines and wings useless against the force tearing at it. The crew were thrown against their straps. The controls fought back. Somewhere in that fall, Andrei Dunovtsev did the thing he had trained his whole life to do. He flew the plane, he caught it, he leveled the wings, he brought the great white bear back under his hands and held it steady, with thousands of feet less sky beneath him than a minute before. The trailing Tu-16, farther back, was shaken hard as well, but it too held together and flew on. When the crews looked at their aircraft later, they found the proof of how close they had come. The bright white anti-flash paint, meant to reflect away the heat, was scorched and blistered. The shield had done its work, but only just. The fire of the blast had reached out across all those miles and tried to take them anyway. And still, the bomb was not finished with the world. The shockwave that nearly knocked the bomber from the sky did not simply fade. It kept going. It raced outward across the whole planet. Pressure sensors around the globe tracked it as it traveled once around the Earth, then again and again. 3 full times the wave from a single explosion circled the world before it finally died away. Hundreds of kilometers from the test, in distant villages and towns, windows shattered. People far outside the Soviet Union, in the north of Scandinavia, felt or saw the effects of a bomb dropped on an empty Arctic island. High above, an American spy plane, a KC-135 fitted out to watch Soviet tests, was in the air to record the event. Even it caught some of the bomb's effects, a reminder that nothing this large could be hidden, and nothing this large could be aimed only at an enemy. A weapon like this belonged to no one and threatened everyone. Dunovtsev flew his battered, scorched aircraft home through the Arctic sky. All 9 men aboard survived. The coin toss had come up in their favor. When he landed, the reward was immediate. The Soviet Union promoted him on the spot from major to lieutenant colonel. He was named a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor his country could give. He had flown the plane that dropped the king of bombs, and he had brought his crew back alive against 50-50 odds. By any measure of nerve and skill, it was a remarkable piece of flying. Yet there is a strange shadow over the whole achievement. Because in the end, the Tsar Bomba was a weapon that could never really be used. It was too heavy. It was too big. The plane that carried it could only crawl toward a target, an easy kill for any fighter or missile. It could not be fired from a rocket. It served no battlefield purpose at all. It existed for one reason only: to prove that it could exist. Khrushchev got the message he wanted. He had shown the world Kuzka's mother. He bragged afterward that the Soviet Union even had the full 100 megaton design ready, that they had only held back to spare the surrounding land. The display did exactly what it was meant to do. It frightened people. It made the world feel, for a moment, how thin the line had become between a political quarrel and the end of everything. But the man who built it came away changed. Andrei Sakharov, the young physicist who had led the design, had spent years at the very top of the Soviet weapons program. He was celebrated, decorated, trusted. After the Tsar Bomba, something in him shifted. He had seen the math become real. He had watched what his calculations could do to the sky. He came to believe that such weapons should never be used, and that building ever bigger ones was a kind of madness. So he turned. Slowly at first, then completely. The man who had helped create the most powerful explosion in history became one of the most famous opponents of the arms race. He spoke out against new weapons. He spoke out for human rights inside his own country. The Soviet state, which had once given him every honor it had, came to treat him as an enemy. He was watched, harassed, and eventually sent into internal exile. In 1975, the same man who built the King of Bombs was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was not allowed to leave the country to accept it. It is one of the deepest ironies of the Cold War. The bomb's greatest creator became the bomb's greatest critic. Less than a year after the Tsar Bomba lit the Arctic sky, the world came within a hair of nuclear war over missiles in Cuba. Soon after that, the major powers signed a treaty banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere. No one ever built a weapon that large again. There was no point. The Tsar Bomba had already proven the only thing it was ever meant to prove, that human beings now held the power to do unthinkable harm, and that the real question was whether they had the wisdom not to. The men who flew that mission were ordinary airmen handed an extraordinary, frightening task. They climbed into a scorched white bomber, accepted that they might not return, and did their duty with steady hands. Andrei Durnovtsev wrestled a falling giant back into the sky and saved his crew. That much was courage, plain and simple. But the weapon they delivered was something the world quickly decided it never wanted to see again. The fireball that nearly swallowed their own aircraft was a warning written in light, visible 600 miles away. It said that the age of bigger and bigger bombs had reached its end. Not because the science had run out, because there was nowhere left to go. The Tu-95 that carried the King of Bombs flew on for years afterward, an ordinary part of the fleet once more. But it had been there for the single most violent instant ever created by people. And the lesson it carried home was not one of triumph. It was a question that still hangs over us all these decades later. If we can build a thing that nearly destroys the very plane brave enough to carry it, a thing too terrible to ever truly use, the real test was never whether we could drop it. The real test was whether, having seen what it could do, we would ever choose to build its like again.